The rain at Fort Benning didn't just fall, it punished the earth, turning the hallowed long-range soil of the sniper course into a thick, sucking mire that threatened to swallow boots and gear alike. The air hung heavy with the sharp, metallic tang of wet gun oil and burnt propellant, a scent that clung to the back of the throat like a bitter memory, mingling with the earthy taste of splashed mud on the lips. Beneath the relentless howl of the wind whipping the range flags into a frenzy, Master Sergeant Logan Murphy stood tall, his Gore-Tex jacket slick and gleaming under the slate-gray sky, the cold sting of raindrops biting into exposed skin like tiny needles. He looked down his nose at the woman kneeling in the mud, a slow, condescending sneer curling his lip as he took in her appearance, the chill of the gale raising gooseflesh under his uniform. Staff Sergeant Riley Patton sat quietly on her worn drag bag, her thick glasses fogging slightly as she clutched an old-school M24 bolt-action rifle, a relic that looked like a museum piece next to the carbon fiber. Suppressed monsters held by the elite shooters, the rough canvas of the bag scraping against her palms. "You lost, Patton?" Murphy shouted over the gale, his voice dripping with a mockery that made the younger, high-speed Rangers nearby chuckle and exchange knowing glances, the vibration of their laughter humming through the damp air. "The S1 paper shuffler's office is 3 miles back in the dry. This range is for the men who actually hunt, not the ones who file their taxes," he added, his words sharp as the crack of distant thunder. Riley didn't blink, her gaze fixed on the fog-shrouded distance where the targets lay hidden like ghosts in the mist, her calm demeanor igniting a firestorm of doubt in the men who thought they knew her, the faint salty tang of sweat mixing with the rain on her tongue. Fictional stories. Real courage. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a moment from Hidden Sniper Stories. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from right now? Riley Patton was 32 years old, but in the harsh, unforgiving light of the Georgia rain, she possessed the stillness of a mountain, her presence as unyielding as the ancient pines swaying in the wind. To the casual observer, she was the definition of unassuming, a woman who blended into the beige walls of the S1 personnel office like a shadow in the bureaucracy, her wire-rimmed glasses perpetually slipping down her nose, catching droplets that blurred her vision like tears from the sky. She wore thin, wire-rimmed glasses that slid down the bridge of her nose when she sweated, giving her the appearance of a frustrated librarian rather than a Tier 1 asset, the cool metal frames pressing against her skin with a familiar chill. Her uniform was always crisp, her boots shined to a mirror finish, and her hair pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful. The hallmark of a soldier who found comfort in regulation and order, the starched fabric rough against her arms, a tactile reminder of discipline amid chaos. The younger marksmen, the Generation Tech snipers who relied on ballistic computers and wind-reading apps, saw her as a relic of a dying bureaucracy, their eyes scanning her with disdain as they felt the smooth interfaces of their digital tools under their fingertips. To them, she was a file shuffler, a paper pusher who probably spent her weekends knitting rather than practicing cold-bore holds, the scent of their high-end gear polish wafting over, contrasting with the faint musty odor of her weathered equipment. They mocked the way she carried her gear, the way she checked the action on her M24 with a slow, deliberate tenderness, as if the steel were made of glass, the metallic click echoing softly in her ears like a whispered secret. But beneath that calm, bureaucratic exterior, Riley Patton was a vault of secrets, and the hinges were beginning to groan under the pressure of the past, the weight of hidden memories pressing on her chest like an unseen hand. When she closed her eyes, she didn't see the rain-slicked pines of Fort Benning. She saw the blinding, white-hot sun of Fallujah, the heat radiating through her gear like a furnace touch, scorching her skin even through layers of fabric. She could still feel the grit of Iraqi sand between her teeth, a permanent souvenir of a rooftop where she had spent 72 hours without sleep, the coarse particles grinding against her enamel with every breath, tasting like dry earth and desperation. In those flashes of memory, the smell of wet pine was replaced by the suffocating stench of burning rubber and open sewers, the acrid smoke stinging her nostrils and eyes, while the distant boom of explosions rattled her bones. She remembered the way the heat shimmered off the barrel of her rifle, creating a distorted veil between her and the insurgents moving through the rubble below, the wavering air hot against her face like a lover's fevered breath. The librarian didn't just know how to file a leave and earnings statement. She knew the exact weight of a human life at 800 meters, the trigger's resistance firm under her finger, the recoil's jolt vibrating through her shoulder. She remembered the unyielding, crisp pull of the precision trigger, the break that felt like a glass rod snapping in the dark, the sharp report piercing her ears despite protection, leaving a ringing echo. Every time she fired a round in her mind, she felt the recoil push into her shoulder like a trusted, forceful nudge, the gunpowder's bitter taste lingering on her tongue from the close quarters haze. In the real world, Corporal Kai Hathcock walked past her, purposefully kicking a spray of mud onto her drag bag, the wet splatter cold and clammy against her hand as she reached to brush it off. "Sorry there, Patton," he smirked, his eyes scanning her outdated woodland camo gear with blatant disrespect, his voice laced with a sexist edge that implied she belonged behind a desk because of her gender, not her skills. "I forgot you probably don't have a cleaning kit in that desk of yours. Hope the mud doesn't jam up your antique," he added, the mockery hanging in the air like the humid mist, challenging her place in a male-dominated regiment. Riley didn't respond with anger. She didn't even look up to meet his gaze, which only infuriated the younger man more, her steady breathing calm amid the pounding rain that drummed on her helmet. She simply pulled a small, lint-free cloth from her pocket and wiped the mud away with a rhythmic, instinctive fluidity that spoke of endless repetitions under fire, the soft fabric soothing against her calloused fingers. It was a gesture of quiet confidence, the kind that comes from knowing you have already survived the worst the world has to offer, her motivation rooted in a post-trauma choice to mentor young soldiers from the shadows of S1, guiding them without the spotlight. The cocky, fresh-faced marksmen around her were hungry for glory, their hearts beating fast with the desire to be the best on a scoreboard, the thrill of competition buzzing in their ears like a swarm. Riley wasn't hungry for glory. She was well fed on the bitter bread of experience, and she had nothing left to prove to anyone but the ghosts in her head, the faint tremor in her hand, a subtle sign of lingering PTSD. She quickly steadied with a deep breath. She watched Master Sergeant Logan Murphy pace the line, his barked orders sounding like the echoes of every CO she had ever served under, the gravel in his voice grating like sandpaper on wood. She knew men like Murphy, men who equated volume with authority and expensive gear with lethality, their bravado masking insecurities she had seen shatter in real combat. She had seen men like him crumble when the first incoming round cracked over their heads, their bravado evaporating like mist in the desert, the sharp crack of gunfire still echoing in her nightmares. Inside her mind, she was back on that Fallujah rooftop, the scorching ambush unfolding in a series of jagged, high-contrast images, the sun's glare blinding her sight while sweat trickled down her back, salty on her lips. She remembered her spotter's voice, a frantic whisper over the radio, and the way her own heartbeat had slowed down until it was a steady, rhythmic drum, the pulse throbbing in her temples. She had been the one to stay behind, the one to cover the retreat when the rest of the team was pinned down in a kill zone, a specific moment where her humility and quick decision to hold fire until the perfect shot saved a pinned squad, forging her agency in quiet leadership. The personnel clerk had held an entire platoon of militia at bay with nothing but 20-round boxes of match-grade ammunition and a cold heart, the brass casings hot to the touch as they ejected. She looked at her hands now, soft, pale, and smelling of hand sanitizer, and compared them to the hands that had once been stained black with carbon and blood, the phantom warmth of that blood still haunting her touch. The contrast was jarring, a secret she wore like a second skin, hidden beneath the starch of her army combat uniform, the fabric's weave-pressing patterns into her arms. "What's the matter, Patton?" Murphy shouted, noticing her momentary stillness, his voice booming over the rain's patter. "Thinking about all those unfiled travel vouchers back at the office?" The crowd laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the rhythm of the falling rain, vibrating through the ground under her feet. Riley finally looked up, her glasses catching the gray light, masking her eyes so that Murphy couldn't see the lethal intensity flickering behind the lenses, the fog on the glass cool against her lashes. "No, Sergeant Major," she said, her voice low and remarkably steady, carrying over the wind's howl. "I was just thinking about the wind." The wind? Murphy scoffed, gesturing to the high-tech sensors his favorites were using, the electronic beeps faint but audible. We've got computers for that, librarian. Try to keep up. Riley went back to her rifle, her fingers dancing over the cold steel with a familiarity that would have terrified them if they actually understood it, the metal's chill seeping into her bones. She wasn't just an underdog, she was a predator who had learned how to look like prey, her senses attuned to every nuance, the taste of impending storm, the scent of oiled metal, the touch of wind-whipped rain. And as the first shooters took their places on the line, the ghost began to stir, ready to remind them that the most dangerous weapon is never the rifle. It's the soldier behind the glass, her resolve deepened by a commitment to outsmart foes through skill born of scars, not swagger. The Top Marksman Invitational wasn't just a competition, it was a high-stakes proving ground where the Army's most elite gathered to measure their lethality. The distant clang of steel targets echoing like promises of glory under the overcast sky. The range at Fort Benning was crowded with the heavy hitters. Special Forces operators from the 5th Group, seasoned instructors from the Sniper School, and the rising stars of the 75th Ranger Regiment, their multicam uniforms blending with the muddy terrain, the fabric heavy with absorbed rain against their skin. Every shooter on that line looked like a recruitment poster, draped in multicam gear and wielding rifles that resembled spacecraft more than firearms, the sleek carbon fiber smooth and cool to the touch, contrasting with the rough grit of the earth underfoot. Then there was Riley Patton. She had been called to the line only an hour prior, a reluctant substitute after a stomach virus had leveled the S1's primary shooter, a young captain who actually enjoyed the spotlight, the sour taste of bile lingering in her imagination from hearing about his illness. As she lugged her faded drag bag toward Lane 14, the whispers followed her like a trail of smoke, the murmurs low and humming in her ears, carrying the scent of damp earth and gun solvent that filled the air. "Is she lost?" A ranger sergeant whispered, leaning against a Humvee, his voice barely audible over the patter of rain on metal roofs. "I think the admin building is that way, ma'am." The spectators, a mix of support staff, off-duty infantry, and brass, chuckled at her entry-level setup, their laughter sharp and biting like the cold wind nipping at exposed necks. Her M24 was a relic of a different era, its fixed power scope lacking the massive turrets and illuminated reticles of the modern age. The woodstock worn smooth from years of handling, a tactile history under her palms. Corporal Kai Hathcock, stationed in the lane directly to her right, made sure his disdain was the loudest, his voice booming with a cocky edge as he adjusted his gear. Hathcock was the regiment's golden boy, a gadget-laden hotshot whose rifle was outfitted with a thermal clip-on, a laser rangefinder, and a ballistics computer that calculated humidity to the 3rd decimal, the electronic hum faint but persistent in the background. "Hey, Riley," Hathcock called out, his voice carrying over the crowd as he adjusted his $400 electronic ear protection, the sexist undertone clear in his drawl. "Does that thing even have a rifled barrel anymore, or did you smooth it out filing all those paperwork folders? Stick to what you know, sweetheart. Leave the real shooting to the men." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd, and even Master Sergeant Logan Murphy, the range OIC, cracked a thin, predatory smile, his teeth flashing white against the gray day. "Watch your lane, Hathcock," Murphy barked, though there was no real heat in his voice, the command echoing off the pines. "SSG Patton is here to represent the Rear D Warriors. Maybe she'll surprise us with her typing speed." Riley didn't respond, she simply knelt in the mud, her movements economical and devoid of the nervous fidgeting that plagued the younger shooters, the cold, sticky clay seeping through her pants, a familiar discomfort like old battlefield muck. She laid out her data book, a salt-stained handwritten ledger next to her rifle, ignoring the sleek iPads and digital tablets the others were syncing to their sensors, the paper slightly damp under her fingers, absorbing the misty air. "Seriously though," Hathcock continued, his barbs cutting deeper as he realized he wasn't getting a rise out of her, his tone laced with frustration. "If you missed the berm entirely, just tell the CO it was a clerical error. We're used to those coming out of your office. Probably because a woman like you can't handle the pressure. The spectators roared, a sharp, mocking sound that felt more oppressive than the humid Georgia air, vibrating through the ground and into her boots. Riley felt a familiar heat rising in her chest, a phantom sensation of the scorching sun of a different continent, the imagined warmth clashing with the chill rain trickling down her collar. She looked at her M24, the steel cold and reassuring against her palm, and she thought of the battlefield secret she wasn't allowed to share, the metallic tang of brass from spent casings still vivid in her memory. How do you prove your scars when the battlefield secrets are classified? The weight of redacted files heavy in her mind like unspoken burdens. How could she tell these boys that she had spent 18 months in a unit that didn't officially exist, doing things that weren't in any public record, the hush of classified briefings still ringing in her ears? She couldn't show them the commendations because they were filed in a CIF beneath the Pentagon, and she couldn't show them her kills because they were just numbers in a redacted ledger. The ink's faint chemical smell, a ghost from those secure rooms. To them, she was a blank slate, a file shuffler with a used rifle and a soft face, their judgment stinging like salt in a wound. The first stage of the challenge was a rapid-fire sequence, 5 targets at varying distances from 300 to 700 yards, with only a 60-second window to engage, the buzzer's shrill beep piercing the air like a starter's pistol. Shooters, watch your lanes. Murphy's voice boomed through the PA system, the speakers crackling with static from the moisture. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the mocking laughter replaced by the heavy tension of a professional competition, the air thick with anticipation, tasting faintly of ozone from the storm. Hathcock settled behind his rifle, his thumb hovering over the electronic buttons of his rangefinder, his breathing shallow and fast, the scent of his sweat mixing with the gun oil. Riley didn't use a rangefinder. She glanced at the targets, her brain performing the MIL.math with the speed of a seasoned predator, her eyes straining through the fog, the distant shapes blurry but calculable. Target 1, 310. Target 2, 450. Target 3, 580. The distances clicking in her mind like tactile notches on a dial. She didn't need a computer to tell her what the air felt like. She felt the thick humidity pressing against her skin and knew exactly how it would drag on the bullet, the moisture heavy in her lungs with each inhale. The buzzer shrieked, a piercing sound that signaled the start of the carnage, jolting through her body like an electric shock. Hathcock's rifle barked first, a suppressed thud as he toggled through his digital settings, his movements frantic but practiced, the recoil's muffled thump vibrating the air nearby. Riley was a second behind him, but her rhythm was different. It was a slow, steady pulse, like a heartbeat, her own pulse steady in her throat. Crack thump. The report sharp in her ears, the recoil a trusted, forceful nudge into her shoulder. The M24 kicked into her shoulder, the recoil a familiar, forceful nudge that she welcomed, the gunpowder's acrid smoke biting her nostrils. She didn't wait for the spotter's call. She was already cycling the bolt, the spent brass spinning into the air in a perfect arc, hot to the touch if she dared grab it. Crack thump, the sound echoing across the range, the metallic tang fresh again. While Hathcock was fiddling with a setting on his ballistics computer that had glitched in the rain, Riley was already on her 4th target, her focus narrowing, the world fading to the scent of wet metal and the touch of cold steel. She wasn't fighting the rifle, she was letting it breathe, her deep POV narrowing down to the tiny dancing crosshairs in the center of her vision, the glass cool against her cheek. The crowd grew quiet as they watched the S1 clerk move with a fluidity that defied her reputation, the silence thick like the fog rolling in. She wasn't fumbling with dials or checking a screen, she was simply part of the weapon system, her senses merged, the taste of rain on her lips, the sound of her steady breath. Time. Murphy shouted, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Hathcock sat up, swearing under his breath as he glared at his tablet, the screen's glow reflecting in his eyes. Sensor interference, he muttered to his spotter, the frustration bitter on his tongue. The rain is messing with the laser. Murphy walked down the line, checking the digital scoring monitors that were linked to the steel targets, his boots squelching in the mud, sending up earthy splatters. Hathcock, 4 hits, 1 miss, Murphy announced, his tone neutral but with a hint of disappointment. The corporal's face reddened. A miss at this level. An embarrassment. Especially for a man with his flawless scores, the heat of shame flushing his skin. Murphy moved to Riley's lane, his expression skeptical as he looked at the screen, squinting through the drizzle. He paused, the data flickering in the dim light. "Patton," Murphy said, his voice losing some of its mocking edge, carrying a note of surprise. 5 hits. All center mass. The dynamics of the range shifted in a heartbeat. The chuckling stopped, replaced by a confused, wary silence, the air suddenly stiller. Hathcock turned to look at her, his eyes narrowed with a mix of ego-driven anger and genuine shock, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Lucky gusts," Hathcock spat, though even he didn't seem to believe it, his words tasting hollow. "Anyone can get lucky on a flat range. Let's see how you do when the targets start moving. Bet you fold under real pressure, like most in your position." Riley didn't look at him. She was already reloading her magazine, her fingers moving with that instinctive fluidity that spoke of 1,000 nights in the dark, the brass cool and slick in her hands. She knew the insults would get worse before they stopped. Men like Hathcock didn't handle humiliation well, their barbs a defense against their own insecurities. They would try to rattle her, to pull her out of her quiet intensity and back into the mud where they thought she belonged, but the chill of the rain grounded her. But Riley Patton had been rattled by IEDs and sniper fire in cities that didn't have names on U.S. maps, the blast's heat and dust still a phantom taste in her mouth. A few cutting barbs from a corporal who had never seen a two-way shooting gallery weren't going to break her, her resolve steel-like, touched by the memory of outsmarting enemies through sheer competence. As she prepared for the next stage, she caught the eye of a retired command sergeant major sitting in the VIP tent, his gaze piercing through the mist. He wasn't laughing, he was leaning forward, his eyes fixed on the faded patch on her drag bag that she had forgotten to hide, the fabric rough and worn under his distant scrutiny. Riley looked away, pulling her cap lower, the brim dripping water onto her nose. The mystery of her past coiled like a spring inside her, tight against her chest. She didn't want the recognition, and she didn't want the trophies. She just wanted the silence of the long shot, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. But as the wind picked up, carrying the scent of wet pine and gun oil, sharp and resinous in her nostrils, she realized the secret wouldn't stay buried for long. The librarian was gone, and the ghost was starting to take her place, her presence shifting the air around her like an unseen force. The weather turned from a punishing rain to a thick, suffocating fog that crawled across the range like a living thing, the gray veil muting colors and shapes, clinging to skin with a damp, clammy touch. It was the kind of soup that made the high-tech optics on the line struggle, their digital overlays blooming with electronic noise as they tried to find a heat signature in the gray void, the faint beeps erratic in the heavy air. Corporal Kai Hathcock was growing visibly agitated, his thumb frantically tapping at the screen of his ballistics computer, the glass slick under his finger from the mist. "The humidity is spiking too fast," he hissed to his spotter, his voice strained. "The Kestrel isn't giving me a consistent reading on the density altitude. How am I supposed to hold for a cold bore?" A few feet away, Riley Patton didn't even have a sensor turned on, her calm a stark contrast to the frenzy. In a move that looked like pure madness to the younger soldiers, she lowered her head and lightly touched her tongue to the tip of her index finger, holding it up into the swirling air, tasting the faint salt of her skin mixed with the moist atmosphere. It was a subtle, ancient gesture, one that predated every satellite-linked computer on that range, the cool breeze brushing her wet finger, sending a chill signal to her nerves. She wasn't just checking the wind, she was tasting the air, sensing the weight of the moisture and the subtle shift in barometric pressure that only a veteran of the scorching desert could recognize, the flavor of impending change on her palate. She wasn't looking for a number, she was looking for a feeling, her senses attuned, the sight of fog swirling, the sound of distant leaves rustling. To the observers in the stands, it looked like a clerk playing make-believe, but to the few old-timers in the crowd, it was a chilling display of environmental intuition, the hush of their whispers adding to the tension. "Look at her," one young ranger whispered, pointing a gloved finger, the fabric rough against his skin. She's not even using a doper. She's guessing. But Riley wasn't guessing. She was merging with the atmosphere, her mind calculating the drag and the Coriolis effect, using the raw data of her own senses. The Earth's subtle spin of felt rotation in her balance. During the mandatory transition period between stages, the shooters were required to clear and perform a basic field strip of their weapons for a safety inspection, the metallic clicks and clacks filling the air like a symphony of preparation. This was where the hypnotic efficiency of Staff Sergeant Patton began to truly unnerve the men around her, her movements silent amid the noise. Most of the elite shooters handled their rifles with a certain level of ego-flashy movements and loud clacks of the bolt, the sound sharp and echoing. Riley, however, moved with a battle-honed rhythm that was almost silent, her hands gliding over the parts with a speed that belied the eye, the steel cool and familiar under her touch. Her hands moved over the M24 with a speed that defied the eye, her fingers knowing every pin, spring, and groove by touch alone, the components' edges smooth from wear. It was the movement of someone who had cleaned this specific rifle in total darkness, in the back of a bouncing Humvee, or while huddled in a freezing hide site in the mountains of the Hindu Kush, the phantom jolt of the vehicle still in her memory. She didn't look at the parts as she laid them out on her waterproof mat. She scanned the horizon, her eyes constantly moving in a tactical reset, a habit of someone who never truly feels safe, even on a friendly base, the distant tree's scent of pine wafting over. As she reached up to adjust the collar of her damp ACU jacket, the fabric shifted, and for a fleeting second, the mystery of her past was laid bare, the material rough and sodden against her neck. A twisted, jagged burn snaked up from beneath her undershirt, a rope of silvered scar tissue that climbed the side of her neck and disappeared behind her ear, the raised skin slightly numb to her touch. It wasn't a surgical scar, and it wasn't a kitchen accident. It was the unmistakable mark of frontline fury. The signature of a flash burn from a close proximity IED or a thermobaric blast, the remembered heat of phantom sting. Master Sergeant Logan Murphy, who had been leaning in to deliver another cutting remark, stopped mid-breath, his eyes locking onto the scar, the sight jarring against the fog. His brain struggled to reconcile the office personnel persona with the violent reality of that mark, the air between them thick with unspoken questions. He knew that kind of scarring. It came from being trapped in a vehicle that was melting around you, the acrid smell of burning metal still vivid in his own memories. It came from surviving the unsurvivable, the blast's roar echoing in nightmares. "Staff Sergeant," Murphy said, his voice dropping an octave, the mockery suddenly replaced by a sharp, professional curiosity carrying over the soft patter of rain. "Where did you pick up that souvenir on your neck? I don't remember any S1 offices getting hit that hard in the last decade. Looks like something a real operator would earn." Riley didn't flinch, her composure steady. She simply buttoned her collar back up, the librarian mask sliding back into place as if it had never moved, the buttons plastic smooth under her fingers. "I tripped in the archives, Sergeant Major," she replied, her voice as flat and emotionless as a dial tone, though a faint tremor in her hand. A PTSD echo from that specific Mosul blast where her humility saved lives by holding position, betrayed her briefly before she steadied it. Old filing cabinets can be quite dangerous if you don't respect the weight. Hathcock laughed, but it was a hollow, forced sound, ringing false in the mist. He had seen the scar too, his own skin prickling with unease. He looked down at his own pristine, unblemished skin, and then back at the desk, jockey with the antique rifle, the contrast unsettling. The dynamics of the range was shifting again, the laughter in the stands dying down as the soldiers began to notice the small things, the way she never sat with her back to the open field, the way her hands never shook beyond that controlled moment, and the way she seemed to disappear into her gear whenever someone looked at her for too long, her presence fading like fog. She was a ghost hiding in plain sight, a warrior poet disguised as a bureaucrat, her senses sharp. The taste of damp air, the touch of cold metal. And as the fog began to lift, revealing the long-distance steel targets like tombstone markers in the distance, their metallic sheen glinting faintly, the men of the 75th Ranger Regiment were beginning to realize that the joke was actually on them, the realization bitter on their tongues. Riley Patton wasn't just a substitute. She was a reminder of a kind of soldier they hadn't seen in a very long time. The kind that doesn't need a computer to find a heartbeat at 1,000 yards, her competence a quiet outsmarting of their doubts. The fifth stage of the Top Marksman Invitational was designed to break spirits, the ridge's elevation adding a dizzying height that made the valley below seem like a swirling cauldron of wind and fog. It was a 950-yard high elevation shot, positioned on a ridge that overlooked a deep, bowl-shaped valley where the thermal currents played tricks on even the most seasoned optics, the distant ground undulating in the heat mirage like a living barrage, like a living breath. The wind didn't just blow here, it swirled, trapped by the geography of the Georgia hills, creating a vicious gust that could push a heavy .300 Win Mag bullet 3 feet off target in the blink of an eye. The erratic rushes brushing against exposed skin like unpredictable slaps. Corporal Kai Hathcock was the first to the line, his face a mask of intense concentration that bordered on ego-driven panic, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill, tasting salty when it dripped to his lips. He had his Kestrel wind meter mounted on a tripod, the digital screen flickering with frantic data points as the crosswinds gusted from 10 to 25 miles per hour. The device's beeps piercing the air like urgent warnings. "I can't get a solid read." Hathcock hissed, his voice cracking with the strain of a man who realized his gadget-laden advantage was evaporating, the frustration bitter in his throat. The wind is quartering from the left at the muzzle, but the trees in the valley are leaning right. It's a literal washing machine down there, and my tech's failing me like it would in real combat. He took his first shot. A suppressed crack that felt small against the vastness of the valley, the recoil, a muted thump against his shoulder. The spotter, peering through a $5,000 spotting scope, shook his head, the motion visible through the haze. Miss. Low and 6 feet right. The sink in that valley just ate your round, the call coming over the radio with a static crackle. Hathcock adjusted his turrets with shaky fingers, his flawless scores from the morning sessions, now a distant memory, the metal dials slick under his touch from nervous sweat. His second and third shots were no better puffs of red dust exploding in the dirt, nowhere near the steel torso, the distant impacts sending up earthy scents carried faintly on the updraft. The experts from the sniper school and the special forces teams fared little better, their high-end rifles barking in succession, the reports echoing like frustrated thunder. One by one, the Army's best marksmen stepped up to the ridge, and one by one, they were humbled by the atmospheric chaos, the fog's dampness clinging to their gear like a mocking veil. "It's an impossible shot in this light," a Green Beret sergeant grumbled, stepping back from his rifle, his voice rough from the dry air. "The mirage is lying to us, and the wind is a ghost tech can't catch what experience feels." Master Sergeant Logan Murphy paced the line, his radio crackling with the frustrated reports from the pit crews, the device's plastic warm in his hand from constant use. He looked over at lane 14, where Riley Patton was quietly settling into the mud, her movements deliberate amid the frenzy. "Your turn, librarian," Murphy said. Though the cutting barbs had lost their edge, his tone curious now. He was watching her now, his eyes fixed on the way she didn't even look at a ballistics computer, the absence of beeps around her stark. Riley didn't just settle behind her M24, she seemed to melt into the earth, her body conforming to the cold, uneven ground like it was a familiar bed. Her breathing was a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the swaying of the pines in the distance, the resinous scent wafting up on the breeze. She wasn't looking at her dials. Instead, she was staring intently at a small, discarded candy wrapper caught in a bramble bush 20 yards downrange, watching it dance in the eddies, the paper's crinkle faint but telling. She watched it dance. Then she looked at the way the fog was shearing off the top of the ridge, the misty tendrils cool against her face. 2 heartbeats before she pulled the trigger, she did something that stopped the stunned murmurs of the spectators, her pulse throbbing steadily in her ears. She leaned her head back slightly, closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, and inhaled the damp, ozone-heavy air, tasting the shift in pressure like a subtle flavor change. Then, she adjusted her hold, not by clicking the turrets, but by favoring the air 3 mils high and 2 mils to the left, a hold that seemed completely counterintuitive to the data everyone else was seeing, her instincts overriding the visible chaos. Crack. Thumped the report sharp. The recoil a trusted forceful nudge into her shoulder, gunpowder's acrid bite in her nostrils. The M24 barked with a sharp, authoritative report that echoed through the valley, the sound cutting clean through the wind's howl. There was a long, agonizing silence. The 3 seconds it took for a 308 projectile to travel nearly 1,000 yards, the air thick with tension. Clang. The impact's bell-like tone drifting back, clear and resonant, vibrating through the ridge. The sound of lead hitting steel drifted back up the ridge, a clear bell-like tone that cut through the howl of the wind, a triumphant ring. The range went deathly silent, the absence of noise heavy like the fog. "Impact," the spotter called out, his voice sounding breathless over the radio, crackling with awe. "Center mass. Right in the V-ring. How? How the hell did she do that?" Hathcock stood frozen, his iPad still showing a wind hold that was the exact opposite of what Riley had just executed, the screen's glow cold against his palm. "That was a fluke," he whispered, his ego refusing to accept the reality, the words tasting like defeat. "She just got lucky with a lull. Women like her don't belong here anyway." Riley didn't respond. She simply cycled the bolt, the metallic tang of brass filling her nostrils as the spent casing tumbled into the mud, hot and steaming slightly in the damp. She waited. She didn't rush. She watched the valley again, her eyes tracking a subtle ripple in the tall grass 500 yards out, the blades whispering in the gusts. 2 heartbeats before the next gust hit the ridge. A gust no one else had felt yet. She squeezed the trigger again, her fingers' pressure firm and steady. Clang. Another resonant strike, the sound carrying triumphantly. Another center mass hit, the confirmation echoing back. "She's predicting the swirl," a grizzled sniper instructor whispered, leaning over the barrier to get a better look at the admin clerk, his breath visible in the chill air. "She isn't reacting to the wind," the instructor continued, his eyes widening with professional awe, his voice low. "She's reading the pressure changes before they even reach the muzzle. I've only seen one person in my entire career do that. Reminds me of the old legends." The jeers had completely vanished, replaced by a heavy, respectful stillness that made the air feel electric, charged like before a storm. The coaches and senior NCOs began to exchange knowing glances, their skeptical expressions shifting into something far more serious, murmurs soft like rustling leaves. Master Sergeant Murphy stepped closer to Riley's lane, his shadow falling over her as she prepared for her third shot, the ground soft under his boots. He wasn't looking at the target anymore. He was looking at her hands, steady and unyielding. They weren't the hands of a file shuffler. They were steady as stone, the fingers moving with a hypnotic fluidity that suggested she had done this thousands of times in places where a miss didn't just mean a low score, it meant a body bag, the imagined weight of that consequence heavy in the air. "Patton," Murphy said quietly, his voice devoid of any mockery, soft against the wind. "Where did you learn to read the air like that?" "That's not a Fort Benning skill. That's a long-range surveillance trick from the shadows." Riley didn't look up. She was focused on the hollow thump of her heartbeat in her ear protection, the world narrowing down to the tiny black dot of the target 950 yards away, the pulse, a grounding rhythm. "The wind speaks if you listen long enough, Sergeant Major," she replied, her voice a low, grounded murmur that barely carried over the rain, tasting of quiet wisdom. She fired 3 more times in rapid succession, each shot timed perfectly to the rhythmic pulse of the valley's thermal shifts, the reports cracking like controlled thunder. 5 shots. 5 hits. A perfect score on the most treacherous stage of the competition. The clangs a symphony of success. The dynamics of the range had been completely rewritten. the shift palpable like a change in barometric pressure. The underdog was gone, and in her place sat a woman who was rewriting the rules of precision marksmanship with an antique rifle and a classified level of skill, her competence a silent outsmarting. Hathcock slumped back against his gear, his gadget-laden setup looking like a collection of expensive toys, the metal cold and useless now. He looked at Riley, and for the first time, he didn't see a desk jockey, his gaze filled with reluctant respect. He saw a predator who had been ghosting them all day, a woman whose scars were finally beginning to tell a story that no one was prepared to hear, the realization dawning like the fog lifting. "Who the hell are you?" Hathcock whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and unearned respect, the words hanging in the misty air. Riley finally looked at him, her wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the gray, stormy sky, hiding the lethal intensity of her gaze, the frames cool against her skin. "I'm the person who processes your leave paperwork, Corporal," she said, her voice flat and final, carrying a hint of amusement. "And right now, I think you should focus on your next stage. Real valor comes from humility, not hardware." But as she turned back to her rifle, the mystery had reached its breaking point, the tension thick like the humid air. The senior officers in the VIP tent were on their phones, frantically calling back to headquarters, requesting a level 5 background check on a certain personnel clerk, the device's screens glowing in the dim light. The librarian had just fired a shot that was heard all the way to the Pentagon, and the silence that followed was the sound of a legend being rediscovered, the echo lingering in every sense. The heavy hum of a diesel engine cut through the tension as a blacked-out SUV lurched to a halt behind the firing line, the vehicle's rumble vibrating through the ground like an approaching storm. The door creaked open, and out stepped Command Sergeant Major Harlan Kyle, a man whose name was whispered in the halls of JSOC like a prayer, his boots squelching in the mud with authoritative thuds. Kyle was a grizzled titan of the old guard, his face a topographical map of shrapnel scars and decades of unspoken service, the rough texture of his skin telling tales of battles past. He strode onto the muddy field with a purpose that made the younger Rangers instinctively clear a path, his eyes scanning the lanes with predatory focus, the air around him charged with respect. The range fell into a vacuum of silence, the only sound the rhythmic slapping of rain against the canvas tents, punctuated by the distant drip from overhanging branches. Kyle stopped dead 10 feet behind lane 14, his boots sinking into the red clay as his eyes locked onto Riley Patton, the recognition hitting him like a physical blow. The air seemed to leave the lungs of every soldier present as they watched the legendary CSM freeze in total, haunting recognition, the moment thick with unspoken history. There was no mocking smirk, no condescending remark, and no bravado left in the atmosphere. Only a rigid, honor-bound stillness, the chill deepening. To the shock of Master Sergeant Murphy and the ego-driven Corporal Hathcock, the highest-ranking NCO on the post snapped his heels together, the click sharp in the quiet. With a crispness that echoed like a rifle shot, Kyle offered a sharp, unwavering salute to the junior staff sergeant sitting in the mud, his hand steady despite the wind. "I thought you were a myth, Riley," Kyle said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried the weight of 1,000 classified nights, tasting of old camaraderie. The truth hit the crowd like a concussive blast. Riley Patton wasn't a clerk, and she certainly wasn't a desk jockey, the revelation exploding in their minds. She was the Phantom of Mosul, a Shadow Ops legend who had been officially dismissed as an urban myth to protect the sensitive nature of her work, her actions veiled in secrecy. She was the ghost who had dismantled insurgent cells from 3 zip codes away, a woman whose precision trigger had changed the course of the war in the shadows, the phantom scent of desert sand still in her memory. "Sergeant Major," Riley replied, her voice steady as she stood and returned the salute with a lethal grace that made the Ranger's breath hitch, her uniform's fabric taut. The librarian was gone. In her place stood a warrior whose frontline fury had finally been dragged into the light, the shift palpable. The silence that followed was the sound of 100 men realizing they had spent the day mocking a living legend because they were too blind to see the wolf among the sheep, the realization bitter. The 1,300-yard target was a mere speck, a tiny sliver of white steel dancing against the dark, jagged tree line of the Georgia horizon, its edges blurred by the lingering fog like a distant mirage. At this distance, the physics of the world began to unravel. The Coriolis effect of the Earth's rotation and the heavy, humid drag of the valley air became physical barriers that mocked the modern ballistics computers of the elite shooters, the air's thickness palpable against the skin like an invisible weight. Corporal Kai Hathcock stood paralyzed, his high-tech optics useless against the shifting mirage that made the target look like it was underwater, the lens's glass cool and fogged under his touch. The stakes were sky-high. This wasn't just a competition anymore. It was a demonstration of a legendary skill that the Army had officially claimed didn't exist. The tension thickened the throat like swallowed dust. Command Sergeant Major Harlan Kyle stood behind Riley, his arms crossed, his presence a silent, reverent stare that commanded the entire range to hold its collective breath, the faint scent of his aftershave cutting through the gun oil haze. Riley Patton didn't check a wind meter, and she didn't ask for a spotter's correction. She simply lowered her body into the mud, her M24 clicking into place against her shoulder like a missing piece of her own skeleton, the cold barrel pressing firmly into her cheek. Inside her mind, the noise of the range faded into a hollow thump of a heartbeat in her ear protection, the rhythmic pulse echoing like a drum in her chest. Her inner voice began the rhythmic count she had perfected on the scorched rooftops of Mosul. A calm, instinctive cadence that synced her nervous system to the steel of the rifle, the memory's heat, a phantom warmth clashing with the chill rain. Inhale. Hold. Feel the pulse in the fingertip, the subtle throb under her skin. Exhale. Wait for the natural respiratory pause, the air tasting faintly of wet earth and metal. She wasn't looking at the crosshairs anymore. She was looking through them, sensing the whisper-quiet lull in the crosswind that only a phantom could detect, the breeze's gentle brush against her exposed neck. She tasted the air one last time, a subtle twitch of her jaw as she accounted for a vertical thermal rising from the creek bed below, the moisture's tang sharp on her tongue. Then came the crisp snap of the sear. The mechanism's release clean and precise. The M24 barked, a singular, lonely report that seemed to punch a hole through the very atmosphere, the sound reverberating in her bones. The recoil was a trusted, forceful nudge, but Riley didn't move. She stayed pinned to the glass, her eyes tracking the invisible bullet arc through the gray soup of the valley, the gunpowder's acrid smoke stinging her nostrils. For nearly 4 seconds, the world was suspended in a vacuum of silence, the anticipation heavy like the humid air pressing down. Clang. The faint but definitive ring drifting back, vibrating through the ridge like a victory bell. The sound of the impact was faint but definitive. A dead center strike on a target that was technically beyond the effective range of her weapon system. The confirmation's echo, sweet in the air. The spotter in the pits didn't even use the radio at first. He simply stood up and held a red paddle directly over the center of the steel, the motion visible through the haze. Impact. X-ring. The radio finally crackled, the spotter's voice trembling with professional awe, crackling like static. I've never seen a 308 group like that at 1300. It's a perfect bullseye. The brash competitors went mute, their silence thick and respectful. Corporal Hathcock slowly closed his laptop, his face flushed with a mixture of humiliation and a new, terrifying brand of respect, the device's warmth fading in his hands. Master Sergeant Murphy removed his cover, wiping the rain from his forehead, his cutting barbs replaced by a heavy, contemplative silence, the hat's brim dripping cool water. There were no cheers, no cinematic applause, and no high fives, the absence of sound profound. In the world of the 75th Ranger Regiment, true valor is proven in silence, and the silence on that range was the loudest tribute Riley Patton had ever received, a hush that touched the soul. She had just reminded every green sniper on that line that lethality isn't something you buy in a gear shop. It's something you forge in the fires of experience and carry in the quiet of your soul, the lesson lingering like the scent of spent brass. The Phantom of Mosul had taken her shot, and the message was received. The most dangerous soldier is the one you never see coming. Her competence a quiet triumph over doubt. The range went cold, but the air remained thick with a newfound heavy reverence, the chill seeping into bones like a lingering embrace. Staff Sergeant Riley Patton didn't wait for the official tally or the inevitable swarm of questions from the stunned marksman, her focus shifting seamlessly to routine. She simply began to stow her kit, her movements possessing the same rhythmic, instinctive fluidity she used to file travel vouchers in the S1 office, the gear's fabric rough and familiar under her fingers. She wiped the mud from her M24's barrel with a lint-free cloth, her touch tender, as if she were thanking an old friend for one last favor, the cloth's softness contrasting with the steel's chill. There was no fanfare, no victory lap, and no boastful look toward Corporal Hathcock, who stood frozen by his tripod, his gadget-laden pride lying in pieces at his feet, the metallic scraps cold in the mud. When the competition organizers stepped forward with the top marksman trophy, a gleaming brass shell casing mounted on mahogany, Riley didn't reach for it, the wood's polished surface gleaming under the gray light. Instead, she looked at the second-place finisher, a young sergeant from the 3rd Battalion who had shot the match of his life only to be eclipsed by a legend, his uniform still crisp despite the rain. "You earned this, Sergeant," she said, her voice a low, grounded murmur that carried more weight than any drill sergeant's shout, tasting of quiet wisdom. "You stayed on your data, and you didn't let the wind get in your head. Keep that discipline. It's what saves lives in the shadows." She walked toward her battered pickup truck, her silhouette a lone, quiet intensity against the backdrop of the Georgia pines, the needle's resinous scent wafting on the breeze. She wasn't interested in the trophies or the sudden, reverent stares of the men who had mocked her only hours before, their gazes now warm with respect. She had a stack of leave forms to process by Monday morning, and to Riley, that duty was just as sacred as the 1,300-yard cold-bore shot, the paperwork's faint ink smell awaiting her. The moral of her story was etched into the very mud of the range. True strength whispers through deeds, not declarations, a lesson felt in the hush. In a world obsessed with high CTR personalities and loud-mouthed bravado, the most lethal weapon remains. The silent professional who has nothing left to prove, her humility a shield. As the narrator, we look at the Riley Pattons of the world, the unsung guardians who walk among us in civilian clothes or administrative uniforms, bearing invisible burdens and classified scars, their presence a subtle touch. They are the ones who hold the line when the world stops watching, and they are the ones who remind us that valor is a quiet fire, not a blinding flash, enduring like the taste of victory. Sometimes, the quietest soldiers carry the loudest legacies, a truth that resonates deep. The legend of the Phantom of Mosul doesn't live in the history books or the loud boasts of the chow hall. It lives in the quiet precision of a single, impossible shot in the Georgia rain, the echo still ringing faintly. Riley Patton returned to her desk at S1 the following Monday, her wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose as she processed the very travel vouchers Master Sergeant Murphy had mocked, the paper's texture smooth under her fingers. But as she worked, the room stayed a little quieter, and the young rangers who passed her door didn't see a file shuffler anymore. They saw the steady hand of a guardian who had already saved their world a dozen times over, her presence a reassuring touch. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more hidden sniper stories. These stories keep the courage alive for generations to come. What would you do if you realized the quietest person in your life was actually a decorated war hero? Drop a comment below. We read every single one. These stories keep the courage alive.